I want to talk to you today about John Milton's arguments in favor of freedom of speech. In 1644, Milton wrote Areopagitica, a long essay dedicated to objecting to an act of Parliament that required that anything that was to be published in England be first given official approval. Milton saw that as a serious restriction on liberty, a serious restriction not only on freedom of speech, thought, and discussion, but also in the end undermining something fundamental in society. The work is called Areopagitica because it's a reference to, the Areopagus, that is to say Mars Hill in Athens. In Acts 17, this is where Paul had to make his case to the assorted philosophers that he should be given the right to preach in Athens. And so what Milton is doing here is saying that idea that one should be able to speak without having to get prior approval, and specifically prior approval of everything you had to say, was really important. So he begins with a quotation from Euripides. "This is true liberty, when free-born men, having to advise the public, may speak free, which he who can and will deserves high praise, who neither can nor will may hold his peace. What can be juster in a state than this?" Keep in mind the context here. Oliver Cromwell and his Roundheads have managed to defeat the Cavaliers and depose the King of England. So they have taken power, partly on the ground that the king was oppressive, but they then turn around and start oppressing others. And Milton sees them closing down playhouses, banning music and any kind of musical performance, and then passing as an act of Parliament in order to regulate printing, that no book, pamphlet, or paper shall henceforth be printed unless the same be first approved and licensed. This is what aroused Milton's ire and made him think he had to make the case to Parliament that it was vital that people be allowed to express themselves without prior approval. He gives us a three-pronged argument, and in a way, it's very easy to understand what it is. There are aspects of Milton's essay that are not so easy to understand, but right at the outset, he says, "Here is my argument in outline form. First, the inventors of it be those whom ye will be loath to own. Next, what is to be thought in general of reading, of whatever sort the books be, and that this order avails nothing to the suppressing of scandalous, seditious, and libelous books, which were mainly intended to be suppressed. Last, that it will be primarily to the discouragement of all learning and the stop of truth, not only by disexercising and blunting our abilities in what we know already, but by hindering and cropping the discovery that might be yet further made, both in religious and civil wisdom." So in short, here are the arguments that Milton is offering. First, who will decide what may be said? His answer, those whom you will be loath to own. In other words, who are the censors going to be? Not people you would approve of. Secondly, it won't work. This order avails nothing. Censorship cannot succeed, he's saying. Now, that is much more true in our day, with all the ways we have of communicating information, than it was even in Milton's day. He had the printing press that had been invented more than a century before, so books were suddenly much more available than they had been. On the other hand, as bad as the problem was in the 17th century, it's much more severe now. How could you possibly try to restrict the flow of information and succeed at doing it? And finally, he argues, it will lead to the discouragement of all learning and the stop of truth, by blunting our abilities to tell what's true and hindering discovery by chilling thought and discussion. So let's look at the first argument. Who will decide what may be said? Those whom ye will be loath to own. Well, in some recent cases, we actually know who was supposed to be deciding what may be said. Here is Nina Jankowicz, who calls herself the Mary Poppins of disinformation. She was to head up the Biden administration's Disinformation Governance Board that would act in something like the way that Parliament was proposing a board to act, requiring that things be approved before they might appear, for example, on social media. Well, look, who are such people? Who is going to act as censor? And how do we choose the censors anyway? Who is going to be the judge? Milton writes, "This office will require the whole time of not a few overseers, and those no vulgar men. It cannot be denied but that he who is made judge, decide upon the birth or death of books, whether they may be wafted into this world or not, had need to be a man above the common measure, both studious, learned, and judicious. There may be else no mean mistakes in the censure of what is passable or not, which is also no mean injury. In other words, we're going to need very good people, very wise, very learned, very judicious people to act as censors. Now, who has such abilities? Who actually has such a superior intellectual or moral outlook to be trustworthy as a censor? But here's Milton's second point. If you could find such people, why would they want to do this? Why would such a person want to be a censor? If he be such worth as behooves him, there cannot be a more tedious and unpleasing journey work, a great loss of time levied upon his head. Who, in other words, would take a job where they're given various manuscripts or various communications of a variety of kinds to make judgments about, to decide, yes, this one can appear, no, this one can't. Who's going to agree to do that? Such censors thrive in our sort of culture, and were thriving in 17th century England. But who would be willing to spend their time this way? Moreover, who would select them? Who would decide who is qualified enough, studious enough, learned enough, wise enough, judicious enough to actually fulfill such a role? Besides another inconvenience, if learned men be the first receivers out of books and spreaders of both vice and error, how shall the licensers themselves be confided in, unless we can confer upon them, or they assume to themselves, above all others in the land, the grace of infallibility and uncorruptedness? Now those are both very important. It's a theme we've already seen in Mill, much later, this idea of infallibility. The person who censors something is cutting off further discussion. They are cutting off inquiry, and so they're not only assuming that they're right and that this opinion being expressed is wrong, they're assuming that no further evidence could ever appear that would lead us to question it. And so, what are they doing? They're not just assuming they're right, but they're assuming that they couldn't be wrong, that they are really infallible, that there is no point in further discussion, further conversation, further evidence gathering, because we know all we need to know on the question. And that's almost never the case, if it ever is at all. But it's not just a question of that. There's also the question of uncorruptedness. After all, we've got to be right all the time, not only about what's being said, but where to draw lines, who can be trusted, who can't be, who is going to be trustworthy, intellectually trustworthy and morally trustworthy to act as a censor. Now, the question of corruptedness is a deeply important one, because the fact is, most of the time, the people who would agree to censor, or who are eager to create regimes of censorship, are those who have a vested stake in the question. They're not typically impartial judges who are judicious and should be trusted. Instead, they are people with an axe to grind. The authorities in particular are rarely neutral. And so suppressing ideas becomes very risky. A mistake becomes whatever it is that the authorities don't like to hear. We've seen a vast number of examples over the past few years in advanced societies where the government bans something or suppresses it on social media as a baseless conspiracy theory, and months or years later, it's now the common opinion. Well, the evidence in favor of it was actually there all along, but it was suppressed. You weren't allowed to look at it. Or it was simply denounced as being debunked by official sources, and so people no longer gave those sources credibility, even when the evidence was right there, often in the scientific literature itself. Milton continues, "Who shall warrant me his judgment? The state, sir, replies the stationer, but has a quick return. The state shall be my governors, but not my critics. They may be mistaken in the choice of a licenser, as easily as this licenser may be mistaken in an author." So in other words, we have to worry not simply about the people who are acting as censors, but the people who are choosing those to censor. And that is often just as critical. As in the recent Supreme Court case, social media companies were acting as censors, but all too often they were acting as censors at the command of the government. The government was saying, I want you to suppress that opinion. I want you to put this person in charge so that that person will approve only what the government approves of. And so it's not just a question of the direct censorship, the judgment of the censor. It's also a question of the judgment of whoever is selecting the censors and giving them their marching orders. Milton says this is some common stuff. He might add from Sir Francis Bacon that such authorized books are but the language of the times. For though a licenser should happen to be judicious more than ordinary, which will be a great jeopardy of the next succession, yet his very office and his commission enjoins him to let pass nothing but what is vulgarly received already. So in other words, we have the problem not only of the people in power, allowing to be said only the things that support their own positions and do not challenge their authority. Also, the censors are going to go on the basis of common opinion. What everybody else already believes, or what the vast majority of people believe, well, that it's easy enough to let by. But the things that people actually challenge, the people who are actually saying unpopular things, things that are not the majority opinion, those are the very people who are going to be censored. So it's really a lack of neutrality in two directions. Those who are going to be making the decisions have vested interests of their own. But even apart from their own vested interests, they are going to just go with the status quo. They're going to go with what is common opinion already. And so it's going to become very difficult to challenge the common opinions. Now that itself, of course, might be in the interests of those in power. But even leaving those questions aside, it's going to be just the ratification of common opinion and the suppression of anything that challenges it. So in that way, it's going to suppress innovation, it's going to suppress challenges or new advances. It's going to be very difficult to discover new truths in such an environment. In short, it's all too often going to be the case that misinformation means whatever those with censorship power want it to mean. Milton's second argument is that it simply won't work. This order avails nothing. It is almost impossible to suppress speech. It is very difficult to suppress written materials. Now, it can be done, they can be suppressed, and people during the pandemic, for example, really did have their opinions suppressed. But the key factor is this. It's difficult to eliminate such things entirely. And when you try, what happens is a general loss of trust in the authorities. People seek other sources of information. So not only does the availability of media make censorship impractical, as Milton puts it, the perpetual reader of unchosen books and pamphlets, oftentimes huge volumes, there's going to be a vast amount of material out there, very hard to monitor at all. If it's going to be done at all, it will have to require a totalitarian and absolutely ruthless state. But the result, even of that, is going to be that opinions are driven underground, where they can't be examined and they can't be refuted. Take a look at where North Koreans get their news. 71% get their news primarily by word of mouth. Foreign radio, 11%. Domestic TV, 3%. South Korean TV, 3%. Chinese TV, 2%. Party circulars, 1%. But notice that almost 3/4 of the people just rely on word of mouth, rely on other people, avoiding sources altogether because they simply do not trust them. This isn't happening only in societies like North Korea. Here's the New York Times. Coffee shops, dangerous hubs of unfettered conversations. Never know what you're going to hear in a coffee shop. So that sort of word-of-mouth communication, very hard to suppress, but you can see it upsets the authorities. They don't like it that people have opinions without having first gotten official approval. Milton's third argument is that it will blunt intellectual virtue and chill discovery, the discouragement of all learning and the stop of truth. Why is this true? He says right near the beginning of Areopagitica, very poetically, as good almost kill a man as kill a good book. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image, but he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Now, why is that true? Because suppression of opinion is something that suppresses virtue. It keeps people from developing their own epistemic abilities, their ability to judge what's right and what's wrong, what's plausible and what's implausible, to gather evidence for themselves, to assess arguments on both sides. Very hard to do that if you never hear both sides. And so the kinds of epistemic virtues that are required to be a discerning, critical thinker in society, those are never going to be developed. You won't be able to be a critical thinker because you'll never be given anything that actually arouses the need for criticism. You'll be told what to believe, told what to think, told what's not worth your time. Milton says, "Since therefore the knowledge and survey of vice is in this world so necessary to the constituting of human virtue, and the scanning of error to the confirmation of truth, how can we more safely and with less danger scout into the regions of sin and falsity than by reading all manner of tracts and hearing all manner of reason?" The argument is this: virtue is forged by trial. We have to be tempted. We have to actually be exposed to some bad ideas in order to develop our own sense of judgment. That's true in morality as well as in critical thinking and assessing various sources of information. We have to assess various claims that people make about how to live. We have to assess various practices and say, that looks like a good way to live. I think I'd like to be like that. I think I'd like to do that. Or other ways where we say, that's a good illustration of what not to be and what not to do. We learn those things by seeing people actually conduct what John Stuart Mill referred to as experiments in living. And so virtue, moral virtue and epistemic virtue, both require exposure to the good and the bad. And if we suppress all the bad, even if we do that successfully, we're not going to allow people to develop their own virtues, their moral virtues or their intellectual virtues. Suppose we could expel sin by this means. Look how much we thus expel of sin, so much we expel of virtue. For the matter of them both is the same. Remove that, and ye remove them both alike. We develop our characters by forming opinions, and being able to defend them. But hey, certain opinions are offensive. People are going to be upset. Certain groups of people are going to be very upset. Well, I think Milton thinks, look, you have to live with that. That's the price of virtue. It is the price of developing your own powers of discernment. As Jonathan Rauch put it, a no-offense society is a no-knowledge society. Pain is required for knowledge. The cost of recognizing a right not to be offended, or even offended unjustly, is simply too high. There's also an argument based on incentives. If you reward offense by actually removing the thing that is held to be offensive, well, what do you get? More people claiming to be offended. So if you reward offense, you get more offense in society, more people claiming to be offended, more and more things banned. People have incentives to claim to be offended, and the restrictions inevitably spread. There is also a vagueness argument, something that Milton hints at, but doesn't really spell out very explicitly. There are many degrees of offense. The lines between factual disagreements, annoyances, irritations, offenses, outrages, and harms are vague. It's a sliding scale. Where do you draw the line? It's very difficult. There is a wonderful essay, a part of his book, Offense to Others, by Joel Feinberg. And here I've drawn him in as the bus driver. He has an essay and a chapter called A Ride on the Bus. Well, what he does is describe a series of events that might happen on a bus ride. It starts with something pretty simple. Someone gets on the bus with a t-shirt with a message you find offensive. But it gets worse and worse and worse. I won't go into it in this video. It becomes really quite disgusting. But his point is that pretty much no one is going to say, oh yes, the very first thing should be banned. And almost everyone is going to say by the end, yeah, that should be banned. It's awful. So it's really less a question of, do you draw a line or not? And more a question of where do you draw the line. It is a continuum. It's a sliding scale. And at some point you have to make the judgment, okay, we'll tolerate this, but no further. Now, where should that line be? The point of his rather long book is it's extremely difficult to draw a line and defend it. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that people who try to draw a line and allow offense to be something that drives them to ban something are in effect pushing that line further and further. You create additional incentives for people to claim offense, and you can point to things along that continuum where, like, hey, if you're going to ban this, then you really ought to ban this next thing. It's almost exactly the same, and well, it is. It's a continuum. And so the danger here is that once you start drawing lines, it's going to be very easy for that line to keep shifting toward more and more suppression, more and more censorship, away from liberty. Well, as Solzhenitsyn stressed, the danger here isn't just a matter of what is officially prohibited, of what the government or its proxies actually suppress. It's also what people automatically suppress. Knowing that there may be suppression of speech, people censor themselves. So Solzhenitsyn says in his 1978 address at Harvard, Without any censorship, in the West, fashionable trends of thought and ideas are carefully separated from those which are not fashionable. Nothing is forbidden, but what is not fashionable will hardly ever find its way into periodicals or books or be heard in colleges. This gives birth to strong mass prejudices, to blindness, which is most dangerous in our dynamic era. There is, for instance, a self-deluding interpretation of the contemporary world situation. It will only be broken by the pitiless crowbar of events. He's pointing out that there's a real danger, not only to official suppression, but to that kind of self-censorship, where people are afraid to advance any kind of unfashionable idea. It's something that is not entirely new. Tocqueville in Democracy in America says, look, in America, nothing is really prohibited. You can say anything you want, but as a result, it turns out people almost never do say anything except what goes along with what everyone else already believes. He was talking about that kind of informal self-censorship. And it's a great danger. One of the dangers is that you corrupt your own database. Here's how one of my favorite bloggers, Richard Fernandez, puts it. Above all, never corrupt your own database. The most dangerous lie you can make up is the one you go on to believe yourself.